to you, but it certainly sounded like it to me. Who is this guy? And where is this voice coming from? But anyway, our genre of the week is poetry. And surprising statistic, this is very vague statistic, but did you know that approximately a third of the Bible, and that's very conservative, it may be more than that, is poetry? Think that a third of it, like the Bible is hundreds of pages long. That means there are hundreds of pages of poetry in the Bible, and it's amazing that we read the Bible all the time and don't realize that at least a third of the time we're reading poetry. And there's a good reason for that. Although some of the modern, more recent editions and translations, they're trying to let the reader know that you're reading poetry by the way they set the type. So they'll set it so it looks like a poem. Now they're very conservative about that. There's lots more poetry than they set into the poetic format, but there is a lot of it, and so at least you know that that's what you're doing, and it's pretty important because you read poetry differently from the way you read prose, as we'll talk about a little bit. So this is a major topic. I know the old sort of VBS thing we did was to say there were the books of poetry and wisdom, right? So you had, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and so on. Everybody talks about those as being the wisdom books and the poetic books. Actually, there are fairly large chunks of those books that are not poetry, and then there are lots of big chunks of other books in the Bible that are poetry. For example, the prophets, and I'm thinking particularly of Isaiah, a large portion of the book of Isaiah is poetry. And fortunately, and again, more modern editions of the Bible, they'll show it that way so that you know that's what you're reading. And here's the problem. I'm going to talk in a minute about what is a poem. But we think of poems, there are two things we think about with poems, just in general. One of them is meter and the other is rhyme. Right? So a poem does this. Da 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 da. Right? And when you're writing a poem, if you're writing it in our typical traditional modern style, you got to figure out English words that'll fit into the da 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 because the meter is sort of worked out for you. It's the same thing that a hymn writer would have if they're going to use an already existing melody. They have to make the words fit into it. So we've got that. That's the meter. And then we have the rhyme. We have twinkle, twinkle, little star. How I wonder, is it what or where you are? I can never remember. What you are?
Yes.
So star and R. That's a poem because it's got meter and it's got rhyme. It comes as a shock sometimes to people to realize that through most of human history, poetry has it has worked that way, particularly the rhyme part. It usually had some meter, but often did not have rhyme. In biblical poetry, almost never rhymes. And even if it did, the Bible, of course, is written in basically in Hebrew and in Greek, which means that if the poetry in the Bible were written rhyming, we wouldn't know it because when you translate, you lose the rhyme. I'm always interested by languages I know a little bit about. When I hear a popular English song that's been translated into that language, I'm always amused by what they've actually done. They have to work a lot on the lyrics because they've got to make them rhyme. And so a lot of things get changed in the meantime. So all of these are kind of issues. But the main first thing I want to talk about this morning is, how do you know in a biblical text if you're reading a poem? And maybe the editor did not put it in poetic style, so you're not sure, like the old King James Bibles, you'd never know there's any poetry in there, even though the whole thing sounds like poetry. I did as I usually do. I went to the sort of big famous standard English dictionaries to see what they said about poems, and some of it applies to one of the poetry in the Bible, some of it doesn't. Here's one, for example, it says poetry is a type of literature typically written in verse that uses figurative language or language that can have different meanings from what is literally being said. So there are two characteristics of poetry according to this dictionary. It's written in verse and it's figurative or metaphorical. Another dictionary said it's a piece of writing that partakes of the nature of both speech and song. I'm going to come back to that. That is nearly always rhythmical, usually metaphorical, and often exhibits the formal elements of meter, rhyme, and stanzaic structure. That's the first time I've read lots of books and things in my life. That's the first time I ever saw the word stanzaic. And my corrector, my computer, what do you call it? The word check. Yeah. Didn't know that either. That's not a word. So, but anyway, what it's trying to say, it's in verses or stanzas, stanzaic. And it's usually metaphorical, although sometimes in a poem it is to be taken literally. So you got to be careful there. The thing I wanted to particularly make a note of is it says that it takes of the nature of both speech and song, because I want to say just a few words this morning about the strong connection in the Bible between poetry and vocal music. Okay. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds or take too much time doing this, but it's important because one of the first things you have to realize that usually if you're reading a poem in the Bible, you're reading something that the author meant to be sung. You're reading the words of a song. That's basically what you're reading. And the reason music has, or the reason that when we sing, we have rhythm and we have meter, is because when you intone the words, you can say, "Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." And you have quite a lot of freedom there in the way you do that. But if you sing, "Our Father, which art in heaven," now you're taking the words and you're putting them into meter and you're intoning them. The words are lasting longer than they do when you talk. And here's an important thing to realize. I'm tempted to say all, but I'll just say almost all ancient worship was the intoning of religious language. That's what it was. That's true. That's not just true in ancient Judaism. That was true in the pagan world and so on. What you did, you took, let's say, a prayer. All prayers were sung. Absolutely all of them. All scripture readings were sung. Everything about the service was sung except the sermon, which didn't take a very important place in ancient worship service. Making sermons the center of worship is a very modern idea. You don't find it in the history of worship until rather recently. I can't stop telling these tales, but I was in this ancient 8th century, 7th, 8th century church in Israel one time with the monks up there. And somebody said, do you have a pulpit? And they said, yes, we do. And they pointed, and up on about what would be the equivalent of the second or third floor, there was a little sort of balcony up there in the back. And they said, if we do have a preacher they preach from back there. They don't want to know who they are. And the emphasis entirely on what they say, but that's the part, they don't really consider that the choir. Everything that has to do with the worship takes place down this way, not that way. And they just illustrate that in the building. Now that's important. We call that, by the way, chanting, right? We say, well, in the old ancient church, they chanted. And we sort of distinguish that from real music, like what we do, you know. And what you have to realize historically is that for Christianity has been around for 2,000 years, and the idea of doing anything in worship except intoning words, mostly the words of Scripture, is new stuff. That's new. That's been added. And I'm always amused that we argue all the time about how to worship, and all the things we argue about have nothing to do with what most Christians through most of history would have considered worship. We're just off on things that I think you ought to do it this way, and I think you ought to do it that way. And most Christians through most of history would say, I don't think you ought to do it any of those ways, or at least I never heard of anybody doing it like that. You know, till to this day, what I call the old churches that have been around and have kept their worship styles, like the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox, or even Russian Orthodox, although it's only 1,000 years old. But the Greek Orthodox, the Serbian Orthodox, the Copts in Egypt, I could go around one after another of these Eastern religions. For all of them, everything in worship is intoned, everything is sung, or we would say chanted. And you may be surprised to know that except in where there's been a strong American influence, Roman Catholic Mass, every word of it is sung. It's very hard to be a priest, a Roman Catholic priest, if you can't carry a tune, because it's all sung. And that's just what you do. And you do it when you pray, you do it when you read the Scripture, and so on. You do it when you give praise. It's all being done with intoning the words. And there's certain patterns to that and so on. Now, what does this do? Well, it adds gravitas, you know. It makes it sound much more serious and powerful when you intone the words rather than just saying them. So you can see that interest in that. It also enables group participation because you can work out a pattern intoning words and we can all do it together. Now you can do that with short things by just speaking, like we say the Lord's Prayer. And we can do that, but if we started, you know, if our service were 3 hours long, like the Orthodox Chrysostom liturgy is, you can't do that for 3 hours, but you can intone the music for 3 hours, and everybody can do it together. The parts that the congregation does, they can do it together. It aids the memory. It's easier to remember it when you got the meter to go, even though you don't have the rhyming. But, and here's the point, even though that's what the early church did, and I can't take too much time with this, but I am convinced that if you went to an very early Christian worship service in the New Testament period, or even into the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd century, everything would be sung. But one thing that intoning words does is it adds a certain level of emotion. Now, spoken words can be very emotional, but I don't know, there's something about intoning, drawing the words out that adds emotion to them. And already in the very earliest churches in the 50s, there were already problems in the churches with letting the emotion that gets generated by the singing overcome the power of the words, because the melodies, the intoning, were supposed to carry the words, but they have the ability to create emotions without the words at all. That's why instrumental music can make you very emotional, even though it's not saying anything in terms of verbs and nouns and so on. You may say it's speaking to me, but that's metaphorical. You're being poetic when you do that. So Paul says, yeah, this 1 Corinthians 14 and 15. I will sing with the Spirit, he says, but I will sing with the understanding. And this indicates that even in the very earliest period of Christianity, there was a concern that what we're doing is we're allowing the intoning to carry the meaning of language. That's what its purpose is. It's the container in which the language comes. Now, many modern songs are based on biblical texts. I'm amazed, and there's some wonderful ones around that. Some of them are word for word biblical texts, and some of them they made some adjustments. So our modern melodies and harmonies and so on will work. You don't have to chant, to do this. Although it's a little harder. I won't get into all of that, but it gets a little bit harder because we do have a tendency to let the melody and the rhythm drive the words rather than the words to drive the melody and the rhythm, which is what Christians have done for centuries and centuries. You started with the words and then you put them into a musical setting that helped in these ways that I have mentioned. It's an interesting thing. There's one particular viewpoint in the Scotch Presbyterian Church. I've been talking about these old churches like Orthodox and Roman Catholic. I should say, by the way, that the Roman Catholic, particularly American Roman Catholics, there's an organ and there's some use of instruments, but they are very conservative about that. I don't know if you know that or not. Some of these beautiful, beautiful masses that have been written by, Beethoven or somebody are never allowed to actually be used in a worship service in a Catholic church. They would never actually have a service with that music. The music is overwhelming the words, and they just don't allow it. The music tends to be simple, and it tends to carry the words. And if there are accompanying instruments, they tend to tell the musicians, cool it. In fact, if there's one bit of advice that's been given to church instrumental musicians for the last 300 or 400 years when we've had instruments in churches, the word has always been cool it. Because every time it eventually overcomes. And, but that's not what this is about today. So, the fact is that the reason the church for 1,500 years or so never used instruments in church is just because it never occurred to them. It wasn't, they thought there was anything, immoral about playing on an instrument. I hope not. I spent a third of my life playing in everything from symphonies to jazz bands. I never thought I was doing anything immoral. But the tradition out of which Christian worship came, the only thing the music did was to give it was a box to carry the words in. And so since and you read the early church fathers, the 2nd, 3rd century, they will say the instrument that we use in our services is our hearts. It's our hearts. And singing is the figure that the early Christians thought of music in church was, I am the instrument and the song is what I play. So other ideas came along. If this were a class on the history of church music, we could talk about that. But that was the original idea. And I talk about all this now just because I want to say that when you're reading the Bible, you're reading it in a context in which these are words to be intoned, and the words are constantly carrying. I will sing with the Spirit, but I will sing with the understanding also. Now, how about when you read biblical poetry, how do you do this? Well, the first place, you are very careful if you're reading a narrative, you don't read it like poetry. But there are surprisingly few sections of pure narrative in the Bible, but there are hundreds of poems. So not too many people are going to make that mistake. But another one is laws, like the Old Testament laws. Now, when we get to law and talk about law as a genre, we'll talk about that. What do you call it when you give away the ending of a movie?
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler, yeah, spoiler alert. Some of you have heard me teach enough to know that I don't follow the Old Testament laws, and I think I have good theological reasons for that. But when I read them literally. I don't try to explain them away. It's people who are trying to take Old Testament laws and use them in the modern day who are constantly wanting to juggle them. Say, well, it doesn't quite mean that, or we got to take this figuratively. Law is a law. It's to be taken literally. It's not a poem. So the legal sections of the Old Testament are to be taken literally. They're not among the poems. So don't mistake a law for a poem. It is interesting. The classic example of this is the first few chapters of Luke, where you get these genres all mixed together in a very interesting way. Luke I always tell students, the first part of Luke is like a Broadway musical. It literally follows that style. You have, there is a plot, you have the characters, and you have them doing things that Luke tells in narrative. But sooner or later in Luke, everybody stops and sings a song. Have you ever noticed that? It's kind of like in a musical. It's not particularly furthering the story, but think back on your favorite Broadway musical, and isn't that what's happening? You got, the story goes along the story, and then suddenly everybody breaks out in song, or the lead character breaks out in song. And that's the whole beginning of the gospel in Luke. You've got, the Magnificat, of course, is the most amazing one, the Song of Mary, but there are several others. And those are obviously songs. They are songs to be sung. And so much of the poetry of the Bible, I think, is meant to be sung. By the way, sometimes the narrative itself can be a poem. That's very rare, but you can tell a historic event and do it in poetry. So you have to watch out for that. Now, just a word or two as I try to wind up here. I've already mentioned that biblical poems do not rhyme. Okay. One of the quickest ways, it's not absolutely always the case, but almost always in biblical poems, you'll find what the literary scholars call couplets. It's a poem if it's written in couplets.
Oh, okay.
Like I said a while ago, it does do that. It may not do it in that particular kind of rhythm. It does it sometimes by the meanings of the words. But of course, since we're not reading these poems, say the Psalms, which are almost 100% poems, to be sung, by the way. Sometimes it even tells you, what the name of the tune is you're supposed to sing to. Unfortunately, we don't know that tune anymore. But you sing these and you try to get the da 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 right, but it doesn't fit. It might fit a lot better rhythmically in Hebrew or in Greek than it does in English. So it kind of loses that in the translation. But something it doesn't lose is this characteristic of the couplet in which you tell. I'm just going to talk to you about two kinds of parallelism. There are several more. And if you're really interested in this, you can do some reading research and learn a lot more about this. But it's the two lines are parallel. but there are different kinds of parallelism. There's synonymous, the two I'm going to talk about, there's synonymous parallelism and there's antithetical parallelism. And I'll just give you one or two examples so you get the idea. It's real easy to spot after you've learned how to look for it. Synonymous parallelism is where you have a line and then you have a second line that says the same thing in different words.
Like the Lord reigneth, blessed be the Lord.
Right.
Let the rock of my salvation be exalted.
You'll just see hundreds of examples in the Psalms like that. One that's not from the Psalms is from one of the prophets, but is an interesting illustration of that is Amos. Amos chapter 4, verse 24 says, you know this passage, let judgment run down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. You see that?
Yeah.
It's
Got it.
it was two sentences. The words are entirely different, but the meaning is the same. So you've got righteousness and you've got judgment. You've got the running down. You've got the waters and the stream, you see. So that's a poem. Amos is writing a poem. And the context around it is more of the poem. Another one that we all know is from Isaiah, chapter 2 and verse 4. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. You see it? It's parallel, different language entirely, but saying the same thing again. That's poetry. And whenever you find a biblical writer doing that, by the way, it really helps you sometimes because if you know what one of the lines means, you also know what the other one means. You know that the author means to be saying the same thing twice. So sometimes one of the lines you'll think, what does that mean? Well, look at the other line and you'll see what it meant. Now, antithetical parallelism is where the second line contrasts with the first. It says just the opposite of the first. And you find that a lot. The book of Proverbs, even though we call it one of the wisdom books, it's almost all poetry. Almost all poetry, sometimes longer poems, but much of it is just the couplet and nothing else. And you'll just go through whole chapters where it'll just be these little 2-line poems, one after another. For example, a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. You see, everything in the second line is opposite of the first line, but the point is the same of both of them. All right. So once you catch on to that's what the Proverbs are doing, it just opens up all kinds of insights that you might not see otherwise. And with the prophets, the same way. Sometimes I just read a passage of the prophets and I'm just totally amazed by what they have done with the language. I don't know what the tune was. I don't know how they intoned it. My guess is that if you'd gone to hear Amos or Isaiah give his prophecies, he wouldn't be shouting them out kind of through a microphone like we tend to think of today, you know, or with a sign saying the end is near and shouting to people who went by. He would be singing this beautiful poem written in these beautiful, beautiful words in which the power and the emotion came entirely from the power and the emotion of the message that was coming through. So that's biblical poetry.
Good job. Thank you. All right, so to look at our at poetry today, we're gonna look at Songs 1, Judges 5, and Psalm 136. We're gonna spend the most time on Song of Songs, but I want to put those other two up there just so I don't forget to just make a couple of observations at least at the very end about them. So Song of Songs, we'll start there, partially because we don't talk about Song of Songs enough in church, and it's really beautiful. I call it Song of Songs because Song of Songs actually appears in the Hebrew text. Song of Solomon doesn't. So the very first verse of Song of Songs in the Bible is the Song of Songs, which is of Solomon. So of Solomon. That's what the first verse is of Song of Songs. It's pretty clear that Song of Songs was probably not written by Solomon, considering that he had 700 wives. And Song of Songs is very clearly about two people who are completely 100% obsessed with each other and each other alone. So it's really unlikely that it was written by Solomon. And the way that the Hebrew is structured, which is of Solomon, probably means which is in the tradition of Solomon's wisdom. So the Song of Songs, which is in the tradition of Solomon's wisdom. Another couple things that are interesting about Song of Songs, the name of it is that Solomon only appears once at the very end to prove what not to do. So the whole song is this woman and this man pursuing each other and longing for each other, really excited to consummate their relationship, and pursuing each other very actively. And at the very end, Solomon does in Song of Songs 8, the very last chapter, Solomon does exactly what you're not supposed to do. He approaches the woman who's been pursuing her what is presumed to be her future spouse. And he tries to buy her love. He offers her money to buy her love away, and she says, no, I can't. And she pursues her partner again. And so Solomon appears at the very end as a what not to do in love, or what is impossible to do, which is to buy love, which is really interesting. And then, of course, Song of Songs is just such a beautiful way to phrase it. It's so, like I said, it's the first thing that appears in verse 1 of Song of Songs. And it is the Hebrew idiom. Right in the title, we get poetry. It is the Hebrew idiom, King of Kings, Holy of Holies, the Song of Songs, the ultimate king, the ultimate holy, the ultimate song of beauty. So I call it Song of Songs for that reason. I tend to prefer that tradition as well. Song of Songs, I'm going to read a little bit of it from the translation called The Voice, because The Voice is a poetic translation. So it's a team of translators and linguists and biblical interpretation scholars, et cetera, who also teamed up with artists, musicians, and poets to translate the Bible in such a way that brought out as much of the beauty as possible. So like John was saying, when we translate poetry into another language, we often lose a lot of the beauty because the words just don't, the wordplay and the rhyming and that kind of thing, it just doesn't match in other languages, especially languages as different as from ancient Hebrew to English. So this translation tries to prioritize that a little bit. The Song of Songs, which is of Solomon. She begins, that's another reason to call it Song of Songs. She's the initiator through pretty much as at least equal to the man, if not more so, throughout the entirety of Song of Songs. Kiss me with the sweet kisses of your lips, for your love delights me more than wine. The pleasant aroma of your fragrance rises in the air. Your name is like precious perfume poured out. This is why young women adore you. Take me away with you. Let's run away together. That's one of the refrains of Song of Songs. They want to run away together. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. There's a chorus too. So this is a libretto, which is one of those, Song of Songs is one of those examples of words to a musical performance that have been put in front of us. So it was probably a soprano, a tenor, and then a chorus that was singing these songs together. Let's scroll down to where he speaks. So verse 8, he starts to speak to her. If you do not know where I am, most beautiful of women, follow the tracks of my sheep. They will lead you to me and graze your flocks of young goats beside the shepherd's tents. You remind me, my dear, of an honored mare among Pharaoh's stallion-driven chariots. The strings of jewels against your cheeks frame your elegance, as also the tender curve of your neck with precious gems. And then we get another chorus that sings. And then jumping down to verse 14. My love is like a fragrant bouquet of henna blossoms from the vineyards of En-gedi. And then he says, how beautiful you are, my dear, how so very beautiful. Your eyes are like doves. Weird. You, my love, are so handsome, a pleasure to behold. Our bed is a lush green field. The beams of our house are majestic cedars, and the rafters are tall pines. So what's funny about this poem is I think one of the things that Song of Songs does is illustrate to us why poetry cannot be taken literally. Your eyes are like doves is just the beginning of some really interesting metaphors in Song of Songs. Sorry, it made me re-sign into my document that I had up for some reason. So I found this online and I thought it was funny and I wanted to share it with you. This is what the woman looks like if all of it was taken literally. Let me share screen so that our Zoom friends can see as well. There she is. Your eyes are like doves. At one point she says, my breasts are like towers. Your neck is like a wall. Your lips are dripping with honey. Let's see what else it says. Your temples are like a slice of pomegranate. Yeah, your hair is like a flock of goats.
It's fantastic.
So clearly, we probably shouldn't be reading Song of Songs literally. Thankfully, Song of Songs is really kind, though, to very clearly present simile to us. So it says you are like, it is like, multiple times. And so even with basic reading comprehension, most of us can recognize the simile format pretty often. So it's helpful to have a nice simile clearly spelled out to us. And we know that poetry is often a little bit more complex than obvious simile. And we should keep that in mind when we read the Psalms or when we read poetic interludes or when we read the prophets, because sometimes simile isn't as spelled out. Metaphor is a good example, right? Metaphor is your hair is a flock of goats, right? We don't want to take it too literally. That'd probably be a problem. Anyway, this is just a random one I found. It was just a random Google. So I'm sure you could find other good illustrations of this beautiful woman. Oh, I like the teeth. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep. I like that one a lot because ew. Anyway, she's not cute. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not one to focus on appearances, but woof, someone's got to draw their line somewhere. So I wanted to share that.
In verse 9, it says that she's like the king mayor.
Yes, I know. So really, this needs to be edited. Yeah. But one of the purposes, so it's really clear from that photo that clearly even these similes themselves aren't meant to be visual similes, right? Because if they were, again, not super huge compliment. What they're meant to do, like all poetry, is to provoke thought of what it means on a deeper level. What does it mean for a neck to be like a tower? I don't know, maybe strong? Maybe has power? I don't know. I'm not sure. It's worth contemplating, right? What does it mean for eyes to be like doves? I don't know. I really don't. I don't have an answer. I don't really know what that means.
They exude peace.
Yeah, maybe they exude peace.
Mournful.
Yeah, they're soft and they're sweet.
Yeah, maybe they're soft and they're sweet.
Flowers
Yes,
and
good.
long and-
Good.
I call it
Yeah,
it's
we
racy, I think, probably, so.
we now understand Song of Songs. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it's meant to provoke thought. It's meant to be something even deeper than like, your eyes are really pretty. That's easy. Your eyes are like doves. That's hard.
I might give you a theory. It's just a theory I have about that, particularly in Song of Songs, that you take the things around in this sort of rural atmosphere of, where there are flocks and where there are and so on. And you take the things that, say, a shepherd boy would see as being things of great beauty.
Yes.
And then here's this girl, and you transfer the things you see every day that are beautiful things to you.
Yeah,
And say, you're like that to me.
Yeah.
A flock of sheep,
that's so good.
the doves, you're like that to
The
me.
king's horse.
Yeah,
Mhm.
right, and that's why,
It's a high
yeah,
position
he's
of
not calling her a horse, he's just saying, the things things that I see and that are beautiful and that create a great
Yeah,
sense of beauty to me. I see all of those in you when I look
Yeah.
at you. So it's wonderful.
and it does seem that he is a
Nice
shepherd boy
Valentine.
in the poetry. Yeah, in the poem, it is, the man does appear to be a shepherd. So that is a really important observation. I'll make one final observation about Song of Songs, since we're like a little crunched on time, which is fine. So oftentimes Song of Songs historically has been interpreted as exclusively allegorical. And I think there is a lot of beauty in the idea of analogizing the love and the pursuit and the intimacy in Song of Songs to what would originally have been Israel and God, God's pursuit of God and Israel's mutual support of pursuit, in an idealized world, of course, because we know that Israel wasn't actually doing that very often. But God and Israel, and then later the church and Christ. I think it's a lovely analogy to our intimate relationships with our romantic partner is like one of the like most vivid ways that we experience love, right? Like it's not the only way, it's not the most important way, maybe necessarily even for everyone. But it is a really beautiful way that we experience love and intimacy. And so I think it's really valuable that to think about that and to express that intimacy. And it's also important to note that most of the archaeological evidence seems to suggest that in the ancient world, including in ancient Israel, love poetry was a really important part of culture. And Song of Songs is in that tradition. And so it is also an actual love song between two people who are actually, in a literal sense, very physically attracted to each other and are not ashamed of it. So I think we shouldn't exclusively interpret Song of Songs as a allegory or as an analogy. I think it cheapens it a little bit, and you can't have the allegory without the literal physical attraction that we experience in our intimate romantic relationship. Like we're missing a huge part of the allegory if we exclusively analogize it. Even though this poem, if you read on, I didn't even choose the spiciest part. And I could have. But if we had chosen the spiciest part, like we can understand why it would make people squirm to read it in public, because that's how scripture was read most of the time, especially once you get to more puritanical times in European history and American history, why we would be a little bit uncomfortable with this being in the Bible. I have read this to students, and they're like, I've been to Christian school my entire life. And I've gone to church 3 times a week, and I didn't know this was in the Bible. And I was like, it's in the Bible, and it's real good. So anyway, I just don't think we should over allegorize it. We should also take it as a celebration of physical love. God created us as sexual creatures, and like that is something that the Bible itself celebrates. Another thing that I think is a really interesting theological interpretation that I don't hear very often of Song of Songs in church settings is there is an element to which a lot of the garden imagery of Song of Songs, there's a lot of agricultural imagery, garden imagery, a lot of it seems to harken back to the Garden of Eden. And so there is an element to which this pure love, this very pure vulnerability and openness, open expression of desire for another person, both physically and emotionally, is a vulnerability that is really difficult to experience in fallen human nature. And so there is an element to which this is idealized. But I actually think that's quite beautiful, that like this is what it looks like for full self-giving. And I would say a lot of humans throughout human history haven't had a chance to experience full self-giving. And yet this is what this poem imagines, is a full surrender to healthy physical desire and expression of that love to another person without fear or hesitation or insecurity. And they just fully trust and fully express that love for each other. And I think that's one of the things that's really lovely about Song of Songs. So I wanted to just mention briefly Judges 5 and Psalm 136. Let's do Psalm 136 first, if that's in front of you. Because it's just I just want to make one observation of it as another clue to poetry in the Bible and in general, I guess. Psalm 136. Can someone read just verses 1 through 3 really quickly?
Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods. His love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords. His love endures forever.
Thank you. What's the poetic device that's used here?
Refrain.
Yes, a refrain. For his steadfast love endures forever. It shows up throughout the entirety of the Bible, or the entirety of the psalm. Every other line is for his steadfast love endures forever. Yeah, his hesed. Yeah, that's the word hesed right there. Yeah. I also just wanted to briefly point out in those first few lines, we get that same idiom that appears in Hebrew sometimes. God of gods, Lord of lords. It shows up here as well. So it's pretty common, a common refrain in the Bible. By the way, Zoom people, I'm sorry. I keep forgetting that my Zoom is on and I'm like leaning in really close to my screen, so apologies. All right, and then let's flip to Judges 5 for a very different sort of poem. So we've already talked about Judges in this class. If you were here for the day when we talked about novella, we talked about Samson at the end of Judges. One of the final, he was the final judge of Israel, kind of before the ultimate collapse of that era of Israel's history. In Judges 5, there is a poetic interlude that retells part of the historical narrative in poetic form. This is a pretty common device in especially the Old Testament. Another example that would be familiar is Miriam's song after they get through the Red Sea during the Exodus. After they get through the Red Sea, Miriam retells the story of the Exodus, of them escaping Egypt and going through the Red Sea. She retells that story in poetic song form. And as a prayer. It's like a prayer and a song and a psalm, that kind of thing. Another example would be Jonah 2, which is a prayer in poetic form that it's not a perfect retelling of what has happened. It's a retelling plus a forward-looking poem. But Jonah is reflecting back on the choices that he's made. So poetic interlude or poetic retellings are really common devices throughout the Old Testament to retell a history or a narrative in poetic form, which is kind of cool. So Deborah is, if you were here for the week on Judges, we talked about how the judges like start off okay and then, or start off like pretty good and then they get okay and then they get pretty bad. Samson was at the end of that story. Deborah is the third in the story, third of 6. So she's kind of right in the pretty good okay area of being a judge, and by judge we mean kind of like a chieftain leader of Israel. So a war leader, that sort of thing, as they're attempting to defeat the Canaanites, but don't do that very well. So there's a battle, and then she tells this story again at the end of the battle. She sings it. She sings the story. So we don't really have time to read it. Yeah, and I didn't pull quotes in advance of like stuff to highlight, but that's there as well. So it's really helpful to know that. Another example of poetry is like the Magnificat, which isn't a retelling of what has already happened. It is a prayerful, like breaking out in song because of the promises for the future, which is another category of poetry or poetic interlude that shows up in the Bible. So at the very beginning, when we started talking about genres, at the very beginning of the semester, we talked about how like you can't clearly delineate each book of the Bible into a genre. You can delineate most books of the Bible into a primary genre, and then there are always exceptions throughout the text. And so Luke is a gospel with poetic interlude, and Judges is a historical epic with poetic interlude. Jonah is sort of a novella and sort of a prophet and sort of a narrative with poetic interlude. So I think poetry is one of those things that helps us see kind of the diversity of genre. And then of course, within poetry, as in English, we have a diversity of genres within the genre. So they're all different kinds of poems that we can talk about. We can talk about a Shakespearean sonnet versus a Japanese haiku, right? And the different qualities of that. And that's not even, that's just structure. That's not even including love poetry versus death poetry, right? In terms of like topic. And how messy that can get. So like we think of Lamentations, which is essentially a book of prophetic poetry, lamenting the fall of Israel. Anyway, so I hope that just like, even though we didn't read a ton today, like those little snippets help illustrate the beauty of Hebrew poetry in particular, and the diversity of the roles that it serves to help us more fully experience God through scripture. So. All right, it's 10 o'clock and we have lots of people to welcome at Waves Weekend. So yay, let's head down there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jim.